Be strong.
On the grounds of the Rodlin Academy is the Rue des Alvens. There stands an ancient forge where the finest metal in the world is forged. Andreas comes to this forge to choose the best sword for himself. He reflects on the fact that Karen is the kind of man who believes that everything he has belongs to him. He has no doubt that he will try to take the page of idleness from him by force. Andreas has decided on this sword. He points it out to the seller, convinced of his choice. The seller asks him if he would also like a sharpening stone to accompany the sword. Suddenly, a woman's voice calls out to Andreas from behind. He turns slightly and sees Diane standing behind him. She looks at him wide-eyed, holding a box wrapped in a red bow. It most likely contains a sword. She asks Andreas what he is doing at the blacksmith's shop. Andreas bows his head slightly and tells her that he needs a sword. Diane looks at him puzzled and doesn't understand why he needs it, since he's a mage. Andreas stands looking at her with a nonchalant gaze. He tries not to attract attention and hopes she won't ask any more questions. He answers indifferently that one sword is useful to carry for self-defense. Andreas notices the box that Diane is holding. She understands his question without words and says that it is a gift for her brother. Andreas immediately thinks of Diane's brother Carlos Alvin. His face is focused. He recalls his face as they sometimes bullied Diane as a child, and she indignantly screamed at them to get off her back. Carlos Alvin is the eldest son of House Alvin. He set out to become a warrior. They got along well with him as children. The image of Carlos Alvin stands before him. He is a handsome young man with long hair and a ponytail. He smiles and has a good-natured face. Andreas thinks about the fact that he is already dead by the time the game starts, so he is not part of the game's plot. Andreas recalls with a serious look that if he's not mistaken, Carlos died at events later in the year. After Hazar escaped from Count Bolarica's territory, Carlos joined a religious cult. The cult of Zephyro is the same cult that organized the terrorist attack. Suddenly, Andreas interrupts his musings and asks Diane about Carlos also participating in the end-of-year events. Diane answers him slightly confused that yes, he is. Andreas remembers how good they were together as children. He sees a picture of the three of them, Carlos, Andreas, and Diane, on a hill. Immersed in these warm memories, Andreas says that it would be nice to meet again, just the three of them. Diane can't believe his words. She stares at him mesmerized, keeping her eyes on him. She is pleased to hear it. Suddenly she remembers something saying that he's been working out hard. Someone saying he's been getting good grades in his studies lately. But she's not sure he's been able to change. She thinks about how she should ask him. She calms herself down and assures herself that she should just go ahead and ask. Andreas looks at her questioningly. His steel sword, decorated with a bow, is already in his hands. Andreas looks at Diane suspiciously and asks her about something she wants to say. Diane flinches in surprise, her eyes wide open. She cries out that she doesn't. Andreas bows his head slightly and tells Diane that they will see each other later. Diane can't find the words to reply and just stares at him silently. Andreas turns his back to her and walks away. Diane stands, frustrated, trying to ask him something but unable to make up her mind. Finally, she makes up her mind and turns around to ask Andreas a question. She gets frustrated. For just then, a door slams sharply shut. He didn't hear her. She stands sadly looking at the door of the forge. The vendor standing behind her is puzzled as to what is going on. Andreas walks out of the forge. After thinking a little about Carlos, he remembers that there is still a little time before the terrorist attack. It is a clear sunny day outside. There is not a cloud in the sky. A dark night has come. No light could be seen in the windows of the teacher's department of Academia Rodlin. Andreas sits across from Heron in complete darkness. Heron holds a book in his hands and informs Andreas that he has searched all over the continent for material of the same quality as Angela, but so far has been unable to find anything. Andreas sits silently on the couch. Andreas sits and stares sidelong, fingers folded. The new sword lies beside him. He hears Karen tell him that he plans to keep searching. Karen flips through the red book and looks in it. He tells Andreas that his hopes are not too high, but he needs material for the congregation this weekend. His face is puzzled. Andreas continues to stare intently at Heron. He realizes that this is where the game begins. If greed clouds his eyes and he asks him to give it to him, then Andreas has won. Karen slams the book shut and tells Andreas that they will now be busy in the near future and tells him to get ready. Andreas turns to the teacher and tells him that he would like to talk to him about something. Sharon tensed, his lips tightening. He asks him what he wanted to talk about. Andreas tries to find the words. He does not succeed the first time. He tells his teacher that he has managed to get a part of the Apocalypse manuscript. Karen stares at him dumbfounded, unable to believe his words. His pupils narrowed. Andreas looks questioningly at Heron. He waits for any reaction from him. Professor Heron clears his throat, trying to hide his laughter. A wry smile is visible on his face. He furiously tells him that he was not talking nonsense, because it is impossible for someone like him to fall into his hands. Unexpectedly for him, a blue magic vortex forms near Andreas. Andreas cautiously puts his hand in there and tells the teacher that he can't handle something like that. Professor Heron stares at the scene wide-eyed. Andreas pulls out a golden magic cube from a glowing funnel. The magical light from the cube illuminates the professor's eyes. He can't believe what he sees. Andreas bends down and presents him with the cube. He asks Karen to take it for himself. Karen presses his lips together. He is confused. He continues to stare mesmerized at the cube. Nervously, he smooths down the saliva that has come up his throat and doesn't utter a word. After a little thought, he refuses to accept it and tells him to keep the cube. He waves his hand and turns his face away. Karen rises from the couch and says that this item everyone is looking for. If he keeps it, it will only add to his problems. He tells Andreas to take the page to the congregation so they can exchange it there. A smirk forms on Andreas's face. He thought Heron would say that because he's the type who values his life more than anything. Karen stands with his hands folded in his pants pockets and tells Andreas that since they will have to go to the congregation this weekend, he needs to clear his schedule and get ready. Andreas dutifully replies to him that everything will be done as he says. It's pitch black outside, 3 bright moons are visible in the sky. Only in the distant forest can you hear the clatter of a horse coming. There's a chariot coming. It is driven by the skeleton of the master of Aura, Nickel. The proud horses are driving the chariot at great speed through the eastern part of the city, the containment zone, the forest of captivity, and the surrounding area. Andreas rides in the cockpit of the chariot. He muses wistfully that he has survived Karen, but now the problem for him has become participation in the congregation. He realizes that there are many dangerous individuals there, and words will not work on them. Andreas glances warily at the Heron teacher sitting across from him. Sharon nonchalantly decides that he can trade the page of idleness for items for his growth. He thinks about the fact that he will take whatever he can in exchange for it. Andreas, bowing his head, slightly smiles. He is amused by the fact that Heron is absolutely certain that the page of idleness is already in his hands. He realizes that if it comes to a fight, Heron will use him as a shield. Their discourse is interrupted by the sharp rumble of a chariot. Heron and Andreas are startled, their eyes wide open. They suspect something wrong. An unknown man in a black robe appears in front of the horses. He takes the horses by the bridle and tells them to stop and be quiet. Nickel, leading the wagon, looks at the unknown man with his eyes wide and his mouth grinning. Heron looks angrily at the unknown man and is angry that he is so brazenly delaying them. The unknown man pulls down the hood of his robe and his face becomes visible. He heads towards the chariot's cabin. Brazenly resting his hand, on which the tattoo has become visible, against the window, he casually greets the passengers. He smiles slyly and inquires about them going to the congregation and asks them if they would let him go with them. Andreas looks at the unknown man wide-eyed and recognizes him. The man looks wary. Without waiting for an answer, the man climbs into the chariot's cabin and sits down across from Karen and Andreas. He sits down on the couch and talks about how they have helped him out. Heron and Andreas, seated opposite him, do not say a word. Tilting his head back slightly, he rolls his eyes and thinks about how this trip isn't that great. He averts his eyes to the side so he doesn't have to bump into their gazes. The unknown man's name is Salem Idea of the continent's top 10. He is even willing to deal with the forbidden for the sake of research, causing him to become known as the devil in pursuit of truth. Andreas silently speculates that if the information about the idleness page leaked, the situation could turn out too bad. Meanwhile, Harren sits thoughtfully nearby. He's angry that Solomidea is riding with them. He is not at all comfortable riding with him in the same cabin. His face shows his undisguised dislike for the man. Suddenly he peers at him, his eyes widening and his pupils narrowing. He flinches in surprise. At the look on Salem's face, he wonders what's wrong with his face. Solomidea face betrayed anger and fear at the same time. His cheekbones are tense, the veins in his forehead puffed up. Is he asking Harren about his displeasure at going to the congregation? Stuttering slightly, Harren replies that it is absolutely not true. Salem backs away slightly, his eyes wide. Suddenly, he starts laughing hysterically. He tells Harren to keep his head down because Salem has been there several times before. Andreas looks at Salem slightly detachedly and thinks about the fact that he knew he was insane, but he didn't expect it to be this much. Salem approaches Andreas sharply, and Andreas backs away slightly in surprise. Salem asks Andreas suspiciously what his name is. Harren reproachfully tells Andreas to introduce himself, since Salem is his eldest. Andreas nonchalantly says his name, Andreas Cromwell. Salem clutches his head in surprise and cries out. Without realizing what he is carrying, he turns to Karen and asks him about laying his hands on another Cromwell. Andreas looks suspiciously at Harren's teacher and doesn't understand what Salem is talking about. He guesses from the way Salem just said it that he is talking about some secret in his family. Salem suddenly realizes that he just said something that apparently Andreas knows nothing about. He covers his mouth with the palm of his hand. In an attempt to change the subject, Salem places his hand on Andreas's shoulder and talks about giving him some special advice then. Andreas stares at his hand warily, not saying a word. Salem looks at Andreas insidiously, his mouth slightly grinning, his eyes sly. He moves as close to him as he can and quietly tells him to fight back as best he can. Andreas glances carefully at Harren without turning his head. Harren, for his part, folds his arms angrily across his chest. He looks very puzzled. Glancing at him, Andreas realizes that judging by the look on his face, he shouldn't be asking him anything right now. Karen is staring pensively off into the distance. They are approaching a body of water. There is a gray fog over it. It is almost impossible to see anything. A vortex is forming in the body of water, and it is bubbling. Andreas can't calm down. He thinks about what Karen is hiding from him. Nickel looks questioningly at what is happening on the body of water. He can't tear his gaze away. Harren opens his eyes wide in surprise. His face is slightly startled, but still angry. Nickel still can't tear his gaze away. The horses pulling the chariot begin to brake sharply, creating dust under their hooves. Karen covers his face with the palm of his hand in indignation. He asks him what he wants. The horses stop right by a body of water. In front of them, the silhouette of a creature in a hat with a burning eye begins to appear out of the water. Karen sternly tells him that if he wants to talk about something, to do it in person. He addresses him by the name Dragon. The silhouette rises above the water, making a noise. It looks ghastly, as if it's forming from the murky water. The eye still continues to glow. The creature that formed from the muddy body of water stood before them at full height. The creature takes on the appearance of a healthy man in a suit and hat. He adjusts his glasses. He looks unpleasant. He apologizes for this, and says that it has been a long time since they have seen each other, Harren Depren. A man in a hat named Dragon is smiling strangely. Instead of his left eye, he has a piece of glass. He has an unusually large mouth. You can see from his expression that he is very unhappy about something. Sweat beads up on his face. Dragon and Harren follow Salem. Andreas weaves in behind them, trailing behind them. Dragon says he didn't think they'd be with Sir Salem. Salem tells him to shut up because his breath stinks. Andreas weaves behind, reasoning that Dragon of the Deep Sea was probably trying to steal a page of laziness, but didn't expect them to be with Salem. Harren points his finger at something, drawing Dragon and Salem's attention. They look intently at where Harren is pointing. Harren points his finger at a strange, long tree. It is pitch black. Only 3 glowing moons faintly illuminate the space. Harren, pointing his finger at it, says that Sir Mosh saw them coming and shows them where to go. Salem angrily wonders why he chose such a high place. Andreas looks thoughtful and focused. His eyes narrowed, his lips tightened. Suddenly he starts smiling broadly. He says he thought so. An unknown person appears in the impenetrable darkness. standing barefoot on the ground with his feet wide apart. His robes sway in the breeze. Heron, Dragon, and behind-standing Andreas stare in horror at what is in front of them. They cannot utter a word. Salem walks confidently forward, holding his way towards a huge tree that emits a faint light, holding a long sword behind his back. The others weave behind him. It looks like the greediest mages have gathered here. Heron and Dragon continue to look on in horror. They wonder about the fact that they are stupid. Salem is trying to get inside the building. The others are farther away, hesitating to enter. Several people in black robes sit at the top, holding glowing circles in their hands. They wonder why they are trying to steal the codex while Salem is with them. Andreas raises his hands up and sprouts begin to grow next to them at an unthinkable rate. Salem stands proudly with his hand up, holding his weapon in it. Sprouts sprouting from the ground wrap around his legs, preventing him from taking a step. He invites everyone to see how many dark mages there are. Salem makes an incredible impact on the ground with his weapon. Sparks glow from the impact in different directions. He hits the ground with his weapon with such force that everything around him flies off. A shimmering blue-purple mana formed above them like lightning illumination. Heron and Dragon head off to attack with unthinkable speed, emitting glowing blue magic orbs. One of the glowing orbs hits the girl in the robe directly. The impact is so violent that she is thrown backwards. One of them, hiding in the darkness, is watching closely. The black mages are wrapped in sprouts. In front of them is a large glowing tunnel. They head towards it. Salem, holding a gun in his hand, concludes that there are about 7 of them. The expression on his face is full of excitement and lust for victory. He pulls out his tongue and begins to lick. His eyes are crazy. He's talking about how they're not going to play hide and seek. Dragon emits a blue light. There is an explosion hitting the ground. Andreas tries to cover his face. He was blinded by a flash of light. The unidentified men in robes are arguing. They are angry that they can't beat them. She of the girls screams desperately that they've been found. Andreas sneaks up on them. The girl shouts to everyone that they need to retreat immediately. Her eyes are full of terror. The girl's eyes are wide open, pupils constricted. She realizes with horror that they are losing this unequal battle. Salem's face looks pleased. He is anticipating the taste of victory. A sly smile can be seen on his face. Salem begins to emit green magical streaks that light up everything around them. Their opponents look on in horror with their heads held high. Salem shouts out that he has found something. Nearby a large tree there is an incredible flash of bright green color. It's like a hurricane. A woman with purple hair drinks tea measuredly from a small mug. A huge monster in a ragged robe sits at a table drinking tea. The cup looks very small against his background. A girl sits next to him, leaning against the monster and sleeping. The creature in the black skull cap looks questioningly at what is happening. Nothing is visible on his face except his eyes. A huge door creaks open. At a large round table sits a woman with purple hair, a huge monster, and a creature in a hat. Salem opens the door with a satisfied look on his face. The others follow him. He turns to the creature in the hat named Mosh and says cheerfully that they haven't seen each other for a long time. Karen, following Salem, greets the people in the hall. Andreas, standing behind him, is holding some sort of sack on his back. The creature named Mosh notices that even Salem has come here. Salem turns to Mosh with a smile on his face and tells him not to be so callous, because thanks to him, the laziness page hasn't been touched. He turns to Andreas, waving his hand, telling him to open the sack. Andreas tries to open the sack. The heads of the very people they had a fight with fall out of the bag. Mosh and the monster look on dumbfounded. The woman with purple hair tries to hide her horror at what she sees. She sits silently and watches. The girl sleeping, leaning against the monster, wakes up and sleepily opens her eyes. She looks questioningly at what is happening. Mosh turns to Salem and tells him that this is an emergency meeting that not many people are attending, and he did these unnecessary murders anyway. The monster sitting next to him looks at the corpse heads and drools with pleasure. Andreas watches what is going on. He thinks about the fact that there are only average dark mages here. In the game they were unpleasant to deal with. He realizes that Salem was able to deal with them just by unleashing magic. Salem stares at Mosh in amazement, his eyebrows furrowed. He can't believe his ears. He replies to him that he couldn't even look at the page without him. Andreas, standing behind him, thinks about the fact that Salem Edid's power will be a force to be reckoned with. Mosh looks at him. Interrupting his speech, he tells him to stop talking about trivialities. He tells him to show him the page of laziness as soon as possible. Andreas looks at Harren judgmentally. He's frowning. His eyebrows are furrowed, his eyes slightly squinted. He emits a blue light from his hand. His face is tense. Salem, standing behind him, says that Andreas Cromwell is a busy fellow, for he did not even blink at the carnage he saw. Andreas remembers standing and watching Salem holding the severed heads in his hands. He did not blink an eye at the carnage he saw. Andreas cuts off heads with his sword. There is not an ounce of fear or disgust on his face. Salem stands behind him and watches him carefully as he does so. Memories of carnage. A multitude of sprouts sprout from the ground and try to grab their feet. Salem, Harren, and Andreas head towards the magic tunnel. Andreas points his hands forward, light magical orbs of light emanating from him. Salem slyly turns back around and talks about Andreas having a double core too. Andreas forms a magical tunnel in front of him. Salem, Harren, and Dragon stand behind him and watch admiringly. Salem is suddenly mysterious and playfully blows right into Andreas's neck. Andreas looks back at Salem in horror and asks him what he is doing. Salem informs him with a lustful look and a playful smile on his face that he likes him. Andreas wonders about the fact that Salem was gay in the game. The girl with purple hair angrily asks him what he is doing. Her face is embittered, she cannot hide her anger. Mr. Mosh stands and looks seriously at what is happening. His eyes shine brightly. He sternly suggests that they end their jokes there. Salem leans over to Andreas and looks at him slyly, squinting one eye. He tells him that he will definitely help him one day, but only once. He tells him to consider it a favor since he is close to the Cromwell family. Salem holds an ancient scroll in his hands. He stares at it mesmerized, his eyes glowing red. He never breaks his promises. There have been several instances in the game where he kept his word, no matter what. After Salem's promise, he suggests that since he's going to help him, he should probably change his plans a bit. Suddenly, footsteps are heard. It is the skeleton of the Aura Master Nickel, creating glowing mana after him. Nickel is heading towards them. He is holding a glowing magic cube. Nickel's face is serious and stern. A girl with purple hair looks at him in bewilderment. Next to her walks Mr. Mosh. He says confidently that this is indeed studious laziness. Of this he has no doubt. Charon, standing behind Andreas, asks him about entrusting the codex to a skeleton. Andreas replies a bit confused that yes, he did. Nickel stands in front of everyone with the rest of the black mages piled behind him. Salem looks thoughtfully at the magic cube and thinks it must be sturdy. Andreas scrutinizes Nickel, who looks frustrated and hurt. Andreas covers his eyes guiltily and tells him to calm down. Andreas imagines evil faces with glowing eyes staring at him intently. He thinks about how he shouldn't take any chances in dealing with these monsters. His gaze is piercing and very serious. He is confident that he can never once be doubted in his actions. Nickel stands in the middle holding a glowing cube. Harren, Andreas, Dragon, Salem, and a girl with purple hair stand across from Mr. Mosh. It is pitch black outside with only the moon faintly illuminating the space. Andreas follows Nickel, who looks very lost and hurt. Andreas tells him to go back. He looks at him angrily. Unexpectedly, Andreas pulls his sharp steel sword from its holster. The girl with the violet eyes, Mr. Mosh, and Dragon stare in surprise, turning around on him. Andreas and Nicola are rapidly heading somewhere, a purple light surrounding them. Their faces are focused. There is undisguised surprise and alarm on Salem's face. His eyes dilated and his wife's pupils dilated, his lips tight with tension. Everyone looks on in horror at what is happening. They didn't expect that this could happen. They all have terror in their eyes. Only the girl in the robe looks at them with loving and happy eyes. Suddenly, to everyone, Andreas stabs his sword into his chest. His gaze is so determined that it startles those around him. Mr. Mosh turns to Andreas and asks him what he is doing. The girl with purple hair standing behind him looks on in horror at all of this. The tip of Andreas's ball digs right into his rib cage, missing his rib cage. At this point, he talks about how he's the one who found the laziness page. Andreas's face shows sly and devious eyes. A thin trickle of blood flows from his mouth. His eyes look seriously at everyone. He explains that this is why he wants his efforts to be appreciated. The violet-haired girl's eyes fill with a bright yellow light. Pink mana forms around her. Plants begin to grow out of the ground at an unimaginable rate. Mr. Mosh looks disapprovingly at Andreas. He is amazed at what he has just done. He reproachfully tells him that greed has driven him mad. The girl with the violet eyes looks at them in surprise and is amazed at what Mr. Mosh says. Blood continues to flow from Andreas's mouth. He talks about how the laziness page is in his magical vault along with the skeleton, so if he dies, they'll never get the codex. He continues to hold the sword that has spun into his chest and calls out to Salem, who is standing nearby. He reminds him that he said he would help him one day and says that now is the time. Salem didn't expect this from him. He looks at him slightly startled. Andreas's eyes narrow. He looks at him earnestly and tells him to hurry, that he doesn't have much time. Salem looks at the twisted Andreas with disapproval and asks about him acting this way because of his words. What if he had tricked him? What would have happened then? Andreas replies that he would do what he could even if he had to die. The girl in the robe and Karen watch, mesmerized. A huge tree sits in the middle of a deep forest. It is illuminated by a dim light. Lights can be seen in the windows in the tree. Andreas talks about how, in order to survive in this crazy world, he is ready to go crazy himself. He's already starting to pale. Blood is flowing from the wound he inflicted on himself. Salem, standing next to him, tells him that he is a funny guy. He looks confident, not the least bit flummoxed by the whole situation. He turns to the bleeding Andreas with a smile on his face and reminds him that he said to fight, but he didn't mean to go that far. Suddenly, a green flash of bright green light forms, blinding everyone around them. Everyone stares in horror at the explosion. Green, horrible snakes with huge fangs appear in front of Andreas's face. Their eyes are bright yellow. Salem holds firmly in his hand the sinner's spear of the serpent of evil, which emits several insidious and bloodthirsty snakes. He tells Andreas that if he insists, Salem's gaze becomes insane. His mouth is grinning, his eyes are wide open, and every vein in his face is tense. He's talking about how then he'll have to kill them all. Salem, holding his spear of the serpent sinner, says with a smile on his face that he will kill anyone who touches Cromwell from now on. A bloodied Andreas continues to hold his sword, which is thrust straight into his chest. The girl in the robe and dragon look on admiringly. The girl screams about how they won't touch him. Salem, with an embittered expression on his face, threateningly says that if anyone doubts this in the future, he will find them and kill them. Mr. Mosh looks at him in surprise and asks about seriously going to fight them over this kid. Salem smiles slyly. His eyes are squinted. He speaks confidently about the fact that Mosh knows him and he won't lie. The girl with purple hair holds her head confusedly and laughs. She is annoyed. She asks them about them all making fun of her. The expression on Salem's face changes dramatically. He is now angry and very determined. He angrily talks about what the hell they all are. He asks about needing to repeat his words. Mr. Mosh and the purple-haired girl look at him in surprise, but do not utter a word. Heron and Dragon watch with their eyes wide and their mouths hanging open. This was something Heron had not expected. The girl in the robe is sitting on a chair. She is so pleased with what is happening that she just exclaims from it. Dragon continues to stare questioningly at all of this and remains silent. Mr. Mosh talks about how nothing can be done about it. He asks Andres what he wants. The girl with purple hair looks at him suspiciously. There is complete silence between the black magicians. No one says anything. Salem and Andreas, standing behind Dragon and Heron, look at Mr. Mosh and the girl with purple hair standing in front of them. Suddenly, something small falls from Salem's hands and rolls noisily somewhere. Andreas puts his hand to his chest and feels a warm glow. His wound begins to heal. He thanks everyone for waiting. Mr. Mosh looks at him intently and demands that he say his demands. Andreas puts a hand to his chin and looks at him thoughtfully. He asks about what he could say. What could he get in return for a page of laziness? Mr. Mosh looks at him indignantly and says that's stupid, that he doesn't even know what he wants. Mr. Mosh shows with his hand that he can choose 5 things from the list presented to Andreas. He recommends that he think very carefully before making his choice. Mr. Mosh is holding a long scroll with a lot of things written on it. He believes there are dead bodies on this list. Andreas scrutinizes the notes on the scroll and thinks about the corpses. He realizes that they certainly must have good bodies. Out of everything on offer, he particularly singles out the former fairy queen Mylene and the tiger king Timur. The fairy queen looks very cute. The tiger king looks fierce. He realizes that they are first-class specimens and he must get them at all costs. Suddenly, Mr. Mosh is called over by Dragon and tells him that these corpses have already been sold to Morn. He reminds him that if he gives them to Andreas, he will be furious. Andreas opens his eyes wide at hearing the familiar name, a look of consternation in his eyes. The image of Morn, who is a mature man with a beard, appears before him. He thinks about the fact that they have been bought by the leading figure of necromancy. He is well aware that if he gets in his way, he will not be without trouble from him. Andreas suddenly hears someone else's voice telling him that it's okay with him and that he can have the items for himself. He stands still and stares wide-eyed, unable to believe what he sees before him. The others also stare in amazement at the creature that has suddenly appeared before them all. A huge fly with a green body sits on the ground in front of them. Everyone stands with their mouths wide open. Karen loudly proclaims that Andreas can't handle such specimens yet. The girl in the robe approaches the fly, which is Morn. She tells Mr. Moss that he has no objection to Andreas taking the items for himself. She turns to Andreas and says that the bodies are in his bag of measurements and tells him to take them for himself. Salem turns to Andreas, standing next to him. He also continues to stand dumbfounded and Salem tells him that he deserves it. Andreas looks thoughtful. He doesn't understand why Mr. Morn is being so generous to him, but at the same time he realizes that he can't miss such a great opportunity. He graciously bows to Morn in the form of a fly and, with his hand to his chest, thanks him for his generosity. He speaks of the fact that he will then now pick out the other items besides the corpses. Karen watches all of this angrily and realizes there is nothing he can do. He shouts curses and wishes he had brought Andreas with him instead of coming himself, taking a page of laziness with him. It's a dark night outside. Only a few stars twinkle in the sky. The huge tree is still lit up with light. A bright light can be seen in its windows. Mr. Moran tells Andreas to take whatever he wants. On the table are the items that Andreas has chosen from the list. They are the bottles of the moon's blessing and fairy tears, the blue flower of Kanangul, the root of Jobin, the orb of Kadunon, and the corpses of the fairy queens Milena and Timur. Salem turns to him and tells him that there are better items on that list and asks him about his confidence in his choices. Andreas puts all the items in his bag and holds it tightly. He talks about how these items are very valuable to him. An image of Lucia and 4 vials of colorful potions appears in front of Andres. He realizes that he can make 4 potions with these items, but they cost several 100 million vials. Mr. Mosh interrupts his thoughts and talks about handing him a page of laziness. Andreas forms a blob of magical light in front of him and easily gives it to Mr. Mosh. Mr. Mosh uses his hands to draw this blob to him, inside of which is a magical golden cube. A girl with purple hair stands behind him and watches the whole thing. Salem comes close behind Andreas and tells him to get ready to leave. He is very taken aback by these words and stands without saying a word. Salem abruptly grabs Andreas's hand and they move sharply into some magical tunnel that formed suddenly. Behind them, the dark mages, who are not expecting anything, remain. Karen shouts to everyone that they all need to follow immediately. Salem takes a firm hold of Andreas's collar in flight and heads somewhere far away from the remaining dark mages. Andreas looks back perplexed and doesn't understand what's going on here. They fly at an unthinkable speed, quickly distancing themselves from the remaining mages. Andreas asks Salem about the fact that they wanted to get rid of him right after he would give them the laziness page. Salem answers him that yes, they wanted to do that. Salem tells him that since he made a promise, he will take him to a safe place. He asks him where to take him. Andreas frustratedly replies to him that he would like to return to Rodlin Academy, that he needs to get to the nearest station. Salem holds Andreas in her arms. They fly high above the trees. Salem is convinced that he needs to go to Rodlin Academy. Andreas answers him in the affirmative. Salem asks him about Bart knowing that he is a dark mage. Andreas looks at him indignantly and says that if he knew, he'd be dead. Salem looks ahead thoughtfully and talks about how fate is an interesting thing. He continues to hold Andreas in his arms and fly somewhere. He talks to him about how he will realize it when the time comes. Andreas doesn't realize what he's talking about. Salem again repeats to him the words he said on the way to the tree. He simply advises Andreas to fight to the end as best he can while he is alive. They fly high above the forest. 3 bright moons glisten in the sky. It looks mesmerizing. Salem says that's when he'll find out who he really is. Andreas has arrived at the academy. He is insanely happy about it. He's laughing. The corpse of the fairy queen Milena lies on the floor. Blue wings stick out of her back. Andreas and Nickel scrutinize Timur's corpse. It appears to be a huge tiger with fangs sticking out of its mouth. Andreas, bowing slightly to the body, says that he didn't think such a big thing would fit in there. Andreas spreads his arms wide, from which a magical light radiates. He had to summon Nickel as a skeleton. He decides that for these 2 corpses, he needs to increase his necromancy level first. The corpses of the fairy queen and Timur are enveloped in magical mana, emitting light. Andreas decides to let them stay there for now. Nickel looks at Andreas in silence. In front of them, a measurement bag is lying on the floor. A red book is sticking out of it. They notice it. Andreas takes the book in his hands, puzzled. He realizes that he was not the one who chose the book to be his assistant. He turns to the book and sees that it is Morn's volume of dark magic. It is a high-level book written by Morn. Andreas opens the book and greedily begins to leaf through it. He guesses that it is a gift from Morn. Leafing through the ancient book, he becomes convinced that it contains a lot of data that he couldn't get in Karen's library. Andreas realizes that if he reads it, he can turn those corpses into powerful monsters. Andreas tensely looks at Nickel's skeleton and wonders what he should do now. An electronic scoreboard appears above him, and it says that the skeleton soldier's legendary chance of evolution is 100%. There are 66 branches of evolution. Andreas was just thinking about when he could improve Nickel. The image of the golden magic cube pops up in his mind. After all, that electronic scoreboard appeared right after he gave the page to laziness. He assumes the codex influenced evolution, but worrying about it won't give him any answers. Andreas decisively presses the electronic scoreboard. He selects the option to continue evolution. Nickel's eyes become crazed. Andreas reasons that there's a 100% chance, so he needs to do the evolution first. The electronic scoreboard began reporting the evolution process, expressed as a percentage. Nickel is still standing, looking perplexed at his hands. Andreas is slightly amazed that the skeleton is not suffering as a vampire. Suddenly, someone knocks on the door. Andreas turns to her fearfully. He runs lightning fast to the door to open it and questions who is behind the door. Nickel, meanwhile, is hiding in the magic window. A pretty girl stands in front of him and smiles contentedly. She jokingly introduces herself as a 3rd year and asks Andreas if he has a moment. In a dark room, Salem and Mr. Morn are sitting at a large table. They are seated on couches opposite each other. Salem is lounging on the couch, his weapon still in his hand. Salem, holding a book, turns to Morn, who is sipping coffee from a mug. He asks if he can ask him a question. Mr. Morn nods approvingly. Mr. Morn is drinking coffee. He frowns as he listens to the question. Is Salem asking him about what he said about the laziness page because he needed someone to defend Andreas? They sit across from each other. Salem waits impatiently for him to answer, but Mr. Morn does not say a word. Salem laughs hysterically, holding his hand to his head. He tells Morn about taking good care of Cain Cromwell and now continuing to take care of his son. Mr. Morn looks at him seriously without saying a word. Salem does not give up. He asks him about Andreas being forced upon him by the Empire. He states that it was so difficult to teach him because he had no talent. Morn asks him seriously if he knows how necromancy came to be. Salem looks at him a little perplexed and asks why such a sudden question. A cute girl with big eyes and an innocent look is staring intently somewhere. She has green hair like Andreas. A young guy stares lovingly at a girl without taking his eyes off. They sit, holding hands tightly, watching the bright sun set over the horizon. There is only them in this world. Mr. Morn talks about how necromancy is the pursuit of immortality. The guy gently places his hand on the arm of the dead girl who is lying on the floor. A young boy bends over the dead girl and still continues to hold her hand reverently. He cries out in pain that he has lost her. The guy grabs the girl and pulls her tightly against him. Tears are streaming from his eyes. He is hysterical. Mr. Morn continues to explain to Salem that, in this example, necromancy is about finding immortality for those you love. Mr. Morn assures Salem that necromancy originated from a desire to be forever with his loved ones. Andreas cannot believe his ears. He is baffled by Morn's words. The window shows that it is beginning to get light. Salem asks him, perplexed, "What is he talking about? He says that it is just a story from the old man." Morn calmly tells him that it may be so. Salem indignantly tells Mr. Morn that he is a wise man and should know what he is saying. Mr. Morn laughs with a smile on his face. He asks him about the fact that he decided to leave everything to his imagination. Salem's face changes. His gaze becomes fierce and angry. He guesses that Morn has something to do with the Cromwell family, not only through Cain. Salem puts his hands behind his head and realizes with a woozy expression on his face that he won't answer even if he's forced to. He says that's why he has to give up. Without listening to his words, Morn asks him what he thinks of Andreas. Salem is outraged and shrieks loudly that he saw it all himself. He gets nervous and says that he's using the zombie bug to peek at everyone. Morn smiles good-naturedly. In Morn's mind, he imagines himself as a fly approaching the foul-smelling excrement. Salem's mind flashes back to the memory of the moment Andreas thrust his sharp, long sword into his chest. Every muscle in Salem's face tenses, his brow furrows, his jaw clenches. He savors this picture in his head and assures Morn that this boy, meaning Andreas, would be the craziest man on earth, even crazier than him. A good-natured mustachioed man, smiling broadly, extends his hand to greet. He introduces himself as William Everlast Hollington. Andreas extends his hand and introduces himself. They shake hands. William has a piece of paper in his other hand and invites him to sit down. Lucia stands behind him. They sit across from each other on couches, a table in front of them. William apologizes to Andreas for having to come all this way for the initial potions profit agreement. He says that he wanted to talk to him in person. William looks at Andreas and smiles broadly. Lucia, sitting next to her father. William explains that since they will be working together, and Andreas has become a close friend of Lucia's. Andreas smiles with a slightly embarrassed smile and says he wanted to meet him too. He thanks him for the help his daughter gave him and for the opportunity to make such a good deal. William rubs a piece of paper in his hands and tells Andreas that he is the creator, so of course he deserves at least that amount. Lucia sits next to him with her arms folded across her chest. William holds out a piece of paper with a red seal to Andreas, on which it says that he gets 60% of the profits. Each potion costs 3 million wilsas, so the final total is over 1 in 8 billion. Andreas stunnedly studies the piece of paper on which this is written. He is amazed at the amount, and so intensely pleased that his mouth opens wide, his eyes shining brightly. He reads that over 1,000 copies have been sold in a month. William replies that they are selling like hotcakes. He is sure that the next sum will be much larger. Andreas kept his eyes on the sheet he had given him. William smiles broadly and squints his eyes slightly, saying that enough business talk. He suggests dinner, because this is the first time Lucia has brought a friend to the house, so he is eager to hear what Andreas has to say. Andreas looks at them unhappily. The only thing he would like to talk about is business. He thinks about the fact that Lucia has also brought a boyfriend and laughs. A month passes. An express train is rushing fast to somewhere. Thanks to the talk, Everlast Potion has become very popular, not only for combat purposes, but also among the aristocracy. To increase production, the trading company decided to expand production. Andreas sits in one of the cars of this train and scrutinizes what is written in the tablet. Next to him is his magic bag with magic items. He never thought that they would sell 2,000 pieces of potion bottles in a month. He looks thoughtfully through the tablet. If he had known this would happen, he would have bought the tablet early. He imagines in his head how to stamp the document William had given him. He didn't expect to make so much money with just the potion. Andreas receives a large number of letters from people. Due to the popularity of the potion, he has gotten more support from the aristocracy. He scrutinizes each letter he receives. Looking out the window, he realizes that he now has 6 billion forks. The image of a beautiful old building with a red roof pops into his head. It's Cromwell Manor, which is worth 3.5 billion wills, including duties. Andreas decides to buy back the estate. If he does so, he will have some more money left. Suddenly, he hears the train conductor announce that the next stop is the National Cemetery, Hartwell Station. The doors on the right side will open. He picks up his suitcase and thinks about the fact that he has a very important thing to do first. Andreas steps out of the train car and thinks only of the fact that he now just needs to return the ring he sold for the body to Raymond, the cemetery worker. A bright red sunset illuminates the entire space. It looks mesmerizing. In front of Andreas, you can see an old cemetery with beautiful shackles. He approaches a house located on the grounds of the cemetery. The bag is not held on one shoulder. He walks straight towards the house. An unknown man in a robe and a metal mask on his face stands blocking the entrance to the building. Raymond stands in front of him and looks at him. Andreas looks at him thoughtfully, not realizing who it is next to him in the mask. Raymond invites Andreas to come inside and drink tea. The man in the robe and with the mask on his face stands with his hands folded and says nothing. Andreas asks Raymond who he is with. He turns around and looks at the man in the metal mask. The masked man is the bail bondsman. Raymond explains that he thought he would need it to avoid problems in the future. They go inside the building one by one. The last to enter is Raymond. On the wall hangs a stuffed deer with antlers that looks like a live one. Andreas and Raymond are sitting at a table with a masked man standing over them, holding a long sword. The atmosphere in the room is slightly gloomy. Andreas looks at the masked man and thinks about what kind of bail bondsman he is, holding a sword and hiding his face. He guesses that it's a brazen lie. He reasons that Raymond has been practicing necromancy for a long time, but he is no better than Charon. He is a weak character in the game. He recalls the way Raymond performs rituals on the skeleton. Andreas recalls his stats. His mana is 2,430. His main traits are dual core and evolution. His talents are dark magic, necromancy, elemental magic, water, creating potions, reinforcement movement, and combat. He is encouraged to learn more about his skills. He realizes very well that no one can compare to him now. Aura Master Nickel's improved skeleton is staring furiously somewhere. He can use aura, so no one can defeat him except the Aura Master himself. Andreas is troubled by a man with a mask on his face and a sword. He is unaware of the power of the dream. Andreas suggests that maybe he should have released the energy of his Dantian. He thought saving it would be a good idea, but now he's not so sure. Raymond holds out a mug of tea to Andreas and says he ordered this tea from someone at the meeting. It's pretty good. Andreas squints his eyes and is a little worried. He says he'd like to talk about the ring if Raymond doesn't mind. Slightly vehemently, Raymond talks about Andreas not being patient. Andreas explained to him that the corpse he bought was an ordinary one, but since Raymond helped him, in exchange he will give him 5 million vills. Dumbfounded by his words, Raymond stares at him. His pupils constrict and the muscles in his face tense. Smiling slightly gloatingly, he asks Andreas about becoming great while he was out of sight and adds that he's also generous, though rotten, but still an earl. Andreas lowers his eyes slightly and smiles innocently. His eyes are covered. Raymond folds his hands on his chin. His teeth are visible, several of them missing. He frowns one eyebrow and says it's too little. He explains that silence doesn't come cheap. Andreas asks with a smirk on his face about what he's trying to say, that he should pay more. He realizes that Raymond is a typical villain. Raymond pokes his finger at him disconsolately and tells him not to worry. He wants to exchange the ring for the thing Andreas got at the meeting. Andreas averts his eyes from them. The masked man stands nonchalantly and listens. Raymond goes on to say that he has heard that Andreas has picked up quite a few things and he just needs to share them with him. Andreas glances warily at his bag. A distraught Raymond looks at him with excitement and asks him how he feels about his proposal. His eyes are wide open and his eyebrows are still as furrowed. Andreas silently swallows hot tea from his mug and closes his eyes. The man in the metal mask continues to stand silently watching them. Andreas bows and sincerely thanks Raymond for the offer. The angry Raymond did not expect that Andreas could refuse his offer. Andreas puts the mug on the table and says he needs to clarify something. He says emphatically that he will give 5 billion and no more. Raymond is starting to lose possession of himself. He's really frowning. His eyes are bloodshot, every vein in his face is visible. He turns to Andreas and says that he doesn't seem to get it. Andreas, calmly sitting back in his chair, tells him that no, he understood perfectly. He's adamant. Smiling slightly wryly, he says that he knew he wouldn't take a fair deal. Raymond is beginning to lose patience with his anger. He remains silent and stares at Andreas, devouring him with a fierce gaze. The man in the metal mask speaks something for the first time. He turns to Raymond and says that they are finished. Raymond continues to sit with his eyebrows furrowed and his eyes averted. Andreas creates mana around himself, from which the skeleton of Aura Master Nickel appears. Andreas thinks to himself that he is tired of this circus. He smiles slyly. The man in the metal mask stares at him intently. It is impossible to see any emotion on his face. But Raymond opens his eyes wide. He's frightened. His mouth is slightly tightened. He tells Andreas that he has only one question. Nickel stares at them angrily. His eyes glow with bright fire, his jaw slightly open. He is the legendary Phantomomo of laziness. He is undead. His level is 5. His special traits are consciousness. His skill is swordsmanship and a special form of laziness. An angry Raymond looks at him. His eyes are wide open. Maddened, he asks Andreas what he thinks this skeleton can do to him. Slightly startled, Raymond tells the masked man that he is increasing the promised amount of money. The man stares intently at Nickel. Raymond orders the man in the metal mask to chop up the little shit, meaning Nickel's skeleton. The man in the metal mask has his eyes showing through the eye holes. He stares at Raymond intently. Raymond also angrily tells him to take Andreas's belongings for himself as well. A furious Nickel is behind Raymond. A crazy battle begins between the skeleton Nickel and the man in the metal mask. Sparks from the impact of their balls are seen everywhere. Andreas nonchalantly continues to sit on his chair. He is absolutely certain that Nickel will defeat him because he is much stronger. Andreas's gaze is brimming with cruelty and self-confidence. His eyes are slightly squinted. Andreas pulls his sword out of its sheath thoughtfully. He thinks about flying bombs. He's used them in the game before. A multitude of flying bombs go off. Andreas thinks back to the battle between Nickel and the masked man. He thinks about the fact that this masked man not only stopped Nickel, but kept her under control. He is an unusual man. The masked man and Nickel engage in a fierce sword fight. The sparks from the blows fly in different directions. Andreas watches in horror from the sidelines. The masked man confidently holds his sword in his hand. He is very determined. Nickel's eyes are red with anger and hatred. He longs for the death of the masked man. The masked man points his sword straight at Nickel. His blows are decisive and merciless. Nickel's eyes are bloodshot. The sword strike flies past him. He grabs the masked man by the leg with his hand, which shows only tendons. The masked man looks at him perplexed. He didn't expect this turn of events. Nickel throws the man with all his might. He flies a great distance away. As he flies, Nickel's sword begins to glow with a blue light. Explosions and sparks from the impacts fly all over the room. Andreas stands wide-eyed and watches what is happening. He realizes that Nickel has filled the sword with aura. Nickel looks bloodthirsty. His eyes are filled with rage. It's not surprising that he's applying aura after he evolved and acquired a Dantian, but is our enemy that strong? Andreas turns his attention to the masked man. He took a confident stance, holding his sharp sword. Andreas stares intently at the masked man and speculates on who the hell is he. Pensive, Andreas notices the man suddenly disappear from his sight. The battle between him and Nickel continues with the same vigor and hatred. Bright flashes of light explode everywhere. The man is all shredded, but not he doesn't lose his grip and fights to the last. Scarlet blood spurts from the wound on his body. It's as if he doesn't notice the pain. Skeleton Nickel lunges at him angrily, swinging his sharp sword at him. The masked man backs away from him, stumbling backwards. Suddenly, he sharply thrusts his steel sword right into the head of the skeleton Nickel, jumping up to him. Beneath the man's metal mask, you can see his terrified eyes. After a blow to the head, Nickel begins to dissolve somewhere, becoming transparent. The masked man looks at him perplexed. Nickel's skeleton turns into some sort of liquid blob. The masked man continues, frozen, to stand and stare at him. Suddenly, to everyone, Nickel, with a hole in his head from his sword, hits the masked man with unthinkable force. The man flies off. As he flies backwards, he smashes through the glass directly behind him and tumbles out into the street. A table collapses, raising the soap. Nickel stands in the window and stares hatefully at the masked man. Andreas stands next to him. A purple-black hole forms behind the masked man, from which someone's hands start to come out and grab him, pulling him towards them. Raymond asks him what he's doing. An enraged Raymond yells at him that if he wants money, he needs to try harder. A red magical flash forms in his hand. Andreas realizes with horror that the bastard Raymond has summoned the undead while he's distracted. Raymond stared angrily at Andreas and Nickel. He's not going to give up. He looks at them, two black and purple holes forming behind him. Andreas and Nickel look at Raymond perplexed. He says that this guy must be a phantom. Raymond continues to hold the red flash in his hand. Behind his back, a black hole has practically swallowed the masked man into itself, with only one leg left of him. An enraged Raymond says that it looks like Andreas got some good bodies at the meeting. Dead men begin to emerge from the black and purple circles behind him. Raymond gloatingly tells him that he wants to see how much Andreas has against his best warriors. The dead are starting to burst out of the ground. Raymond reminds Andreas that they are standing on a mountain of corpses. A multitude of rebellious monsters are confidently heading towards the building. Andreas realizes with horror that they are surrounded. He tells Nickel, standing next to him, to split up immediately. Andreas and Nickel scatter. They decide that they will return as Raymond when the time is right. Andreas flies out of the window with a crash. Everything around him explodes. In the street, the rebel dead, summoned by Raymond, are waiting for him. He runs past a crowd of dead things and with his sword grates them to pieces along the way. He runs at an unthinkable speed, moving away from the building. His blows shatter the dead men coming toward him. The enraged rebel monsters catch up to Andreas, trying to destroy him with their weapons. Andreas turns on them but doesn't stop. Suddenly, Andreas uses an earth shield to fence them in and buy time. But the shield doesn't help him, and the dead still confidently head after him. They destroy the defense shield. Andreas, confused, realizes that there is no end to the rising dead. Andreas decides to use the stone spear. He points it at the bodies of the dead, and they fly away from the blows with extraordinary force. Andreas disposes of a lot of dead people, but there are still a lot of them. The reanimated dead begin using bows and arrows in battle, aiming them at Andreas. Andreas squints his eyes indignantly. A plan appears in his head. He swings his steel sword with such force that all dead people approaching him are blown to bones and pieces. He looks absolutely confident. His movements and sword strokes are so elaborate and decisive that the dead don't stand a chance. Raymond stands behind his army of dead men, waving his arms angrily, shouting that they are useless idiots who can't handle an ordinary kid. Raymond turns back and watches in horror at what is happening. Behind his back, a furious battle continues between the skeleton Nickel and the masked man. Nickel's sword glows with a blue light. The masked man, cursing angrily at Nickel's skeleton, tries to defend himself against his blows with his sword. Nickel's skeleton's eyes are filled with blood and hatred. He is absolutely ruthless. Hidden beneath his garb are flying bombs, which he is soon preparing to use. There's an unreal explosion of tremendous force. You can't see what's going on down there. One of the risen dead screams violently. His skin has disintegrated, his bones are visible. Skeleton Nickel is putting up a fierce fight. He realizes he doesn't have time to drink the recovery potion. Andreas swings his sword with all his might to cut through his opponents. At this rate, things could get ugly. Andreas's sharp sword strikes one after another, cutting them to pieces. He's already running out of strength, but he's not about to give up. Desperately, he's already starting to laugh. While thrusting his sword into one of the dead men, Andreas notices that he is nowhere to observe Nickel's skeleton. One of the dead men fiercely grabs Andreas by the neck and hair. A multitude of dead men swarm around him. Andreas feels his body go numb. He feels as if every muscle in his body is torn. One of the ugly dead men regurgitates everything in it. A jet of vomit flew out of its mouth. The vomitous mass lands right on Andreas's robe. The ugly monster stands not far from him, continuing to regurgitate. Andreas wonders with horror whether he can stand to the end and not give up before Nickel returns. He angrily chops off the head with his sword of the freak who just regurgitated on him. He is merciless. Suddenly, Andreas notices something terrible in front of him. His gaze is frightened. In front of him stands a horrible dead man with an axe in his hand, which he swings directly at Andreas. Andreas manages to react deftly, putting his sword in front of the blow to defend himself. A multitude of rebel monsters are determinedly coming at him. They are advancing so fast that clots of dust form under their feet. Defending himself against the terrifying dead man, Andreas falls down and swings his foot with insane force that hits the dead man right in the face. Andreas falls to the ground with a clatter. The horrible dead man throws back his head. The dead man immediately regains consciousness as if the blow never happened and looks at Andreas fearfully. Andreas no longer has the strength to fight. He stares at the horrible dead man in confusion. Suddenly, the dead man bangs his skull against Andreas's head. Andreas's gaze is devastated. Andreas falls to the ground and the dead man sits right on top of him, trying to finish him off. Andreas can't believe that. The dead man punches Andreas in the face with unimaginable force. Andreas's face is mangled, and he has no strength to resist. He thinks about the fact that he will die here at the hands of some skeleton knight. The skeleton knight is merciless. His blows are so powerful and strong that he practically knocks out Andreas. Andreas remembers his little sister Emmy's face and thinks about what would happen to her if he died. He remembers the faces of Lucia and little Vivian. He had never helped Lucia find a cure for her illness. There is a black shroud before his eyes, upon which a bright flash of light suddenly forms. He finally realizes that he has a reason to live. Andreas angrily clenches his jaw so that all his teeth are visible. Blood streams down his face. He decisively realizes that he can't die like this. A bright flash of light burns. The electronic scoreboard reads that with the help of prolonged training, talent, and brutal fighting, Andreas awakened an aura. Andreas's body begins to fill with light. He feels a blue light appear in his chest and a scarlet light below. He is perplexed as to what is happening to his body. All his vessels overflow with bright light. The electronic scoreboard reads that the Dantian has been activated. He can use the aura given to him. It is further reported that thanks to the double core trait, he can use mana and aura at the same time. Suddenly, Andreas begins to overpower. He grasped the sword beside him sharply. With one sword strike, he mercilessly slices through the skeleton knight's body. At this moment, all he thinks about is that he will return to his place. Andreas's face is ugly. His nose is broken, and a trickle of scarlet blood runs from his mouth. He won the battle against the skeleton knight. At this moment, the achievement, Second Awakening, will activate. Andreas gathers his strength, stands up and heads somewhere. Piles of skeletons lie beneath his feet. He can barely move, holding his shoulder and limping. Suddenly, he hears someone's pitiful cry for help. Andreas walks up to the house and sees Raymond standing in front of him, who has called out for help and the skeleton Nickel. Nickel silently points his sword directly at Raymond, and the latter frightenedly backs away. Andreas walks close to Raymond. His gaze is unfazed. The only thing he is interested in right now is where is his ring. He asks this question to a frightened Raymond. With a crazed expression on his face, Raymond suggests they put the sword away and then talk. He points to the corpse of a masked man lying nearby. His head is severed. Raymond says that one is already dead, so it will be easier for Andreas to make a deal. Andreas looks at the corpse, while Nickel still holds the sword to Raymond's neck. Andreas walks over to the man's corpse and examines him. The mask still hasn't come off his face. Andreas looks at the corpse thoughtfully and decides that since this is how things turned out, it would be better if he took his sword. He picks up the sword of the masked man's corpse from the ground. He holds it firmly in his hand and looks at it admiringly. Raymond tries to stop him. He was counting on keeping that sword for himself. Nickel pokes him with his sword. Andreas looks at him nonchalantly and continues to ask where the ring he gave him is. Raymond doesn't give up. He suggests that Andreas wait a little longer. He's up to something bad. A flash of light illuminates his eyes. Suddenly he feels unbearable pain. He howls in pain. Andreas viciously chops off his right arm at the elbow. It flies off and falls not far from Raymond. Andreas falls to the ground with a clatter. The horrible dead man throws back his head. Andreas stands smugly and looks at him. There isn't an ounce of pity in his eyes for Raymond. Raymond starts coughing violently and curling up. He is inexplicably in pain. Andreas looks at him questioningly without saying a word. Raymond clutches at his throat and coughs even harder. Blood begins to flow from his mouth. He chokes on the blood. Suddenly, he falls face down on the grass. He tries to crawl somewhere. Andreas, standing behind him, froze. Crawling away, Raymond falls to the ground, face down in the grass. He's dead. Andreas looks at his sword and thinks about the fact that this was his plan to get rid of Raymond. There isn't a twinge of regret in his eyes. Suddenly, Andreas looks at the sword and realizes that the masked man's sword is poisoned. Andreas approaches the severed head of the masked man and thinks about the fact that he's a pretty skilled swordsman with a poisoned sword. He thinks about who he is. Suddenly, he remembers the moment when the masked man begins to be grabbed by his hands and pulled into the black and purple hole. At that moment, Raymond addresses him by the name of Den. Andreas immediately guesses that this is the bloody Den. Andreas crouches closer to him, trying to pull the mask off his face. He decides that if it's really him, this mask has changed just as he thought. Andreas removes his mask and sees before him the face of an unknown young boy. He puts the mask to his face. It looks unpleasant. As he puts on the mask, Andreas feels an extraordinary surge of strength. He scrutinizes his hands. A blue light illuminates around him. Andreas pulls off his mask and examines it. He is amazed that he even had an appearance-changing mask. Nickel stands behind him without realizing anything. Andreas suggests that this mask would be just right for Nickel. The man in the metal mask is Bloody Dan, the man who started the war in the game. Bloody Dan grabs the sack and slings it over his shoulder. Later in the game, he is to be hired to kidnap the daughter of the leader of the server barbarians, leading to a war between the North and the Empire. Andreas stands pensively looking at the decapitated Dan. Dead men's bones are lying around them. According to the story, the war was supposed to spread across the continent, and he was supposed to be dragged into it too, but it seems he accidentally prevented it. With a tired look, Andreas concludes that the Bloody Den wasn't the right character to live to a ripe old age anyway. He thanks him for the mask and tells him that he'll find a good use for it. It's starting to dawn. There is no light in the windows of the building. Andreas tells Nickel to find the ring, but he stays behind to clean up the place. It is a clear, sunny day. In the thicket of trees, you can see a building with a round dome. It's the Alwyn Street Clinic. Andreas clicks on the screen of the tablet. It shows pictures of Raymond and the Bloody Dan and writes the news. Andreas lies in his chamber studying the news, which reports that there has been a terror attack in the National Cemetery. The Necromancer Raymond and his mercenary were fighting for gold. Andreas sighs with relief and is glad that he will not be affected in any way. Andreas decides that it is time for him to do the most important thing. He lies in a bright room on a bed, his legs covered with a blanket. He clicks on the tablet screen. The screen shows the Cromwell estate. He buys it for 2.5 billion wills, including taxes and duties. He pays for the purchase and is very happy about it. Happy Andreas thinks about what reaction his little sister Emmy will have to the fact that he's got the house back. Suddenly, someone interrupts his happy thoughts and covers his eyes with the palms of their hands from behind. A feminine voice playfully suggests he guess who it is. Lucia stands behind him, covering his eyes with her palms and waiting for him to react. But Andreas remains calmly silent and continues to hold the tablet in his hands. Lucia can't stand it and walks up to him, calling him a nerd. Andreas greets her but doesn't look in her direction. Lucia brought a basket with a variety of fruit. She asks him what his reaction to her is. She says frustratedly that his cute little junior partner came to see him. Andreas smiles kindly and sincerely thanks Vivian for it. Lucia jokingly twists the phrase Andreas said and laughs. Andreas is perplexed, wondering what he should have answered. His gaze expresses irritation. Lucia looks at him suspiciously and wonders what has happened to him. Andreas can't think of what to say to her. Remembering the dead faces of Raymond and Dan, he smiles. At the same time, he says that nothing special happened. He just overdid it in training. Lucia continues to stare at him suspiciously. Slightly angry, she tells him that at this rate he will die one day. Suddenly, an angry Vivian bursts into the room. Andreas didn't expect to see her here. Vivian's eyes fill with tears when she sees Andreas's terrible condition. She struggles to keep from crying. Vivian froze in the aisle. Andreas looks at her questioningly. Lucius gives her a displeased look. For a few seconds, Vivian stands silent and stares at Andreas lying in the bed and can't find the words. Her eyes are wide open and her pupils constricted, her lips slightly tightened. She is about to cry. She turns to Andreas, calling him Mr. Fairy. She runs up to him lightning fast. Only the sound of her heels can be heard. Lucia stares in amazement at what is happening. Her eyes are wide open. She's getting a little uncomfortable. Vivian falls sharply onto Andreas's stomach. He jumps up in surprise and stares at her in amazement. Andreas looks at her perplexed. He is struck by the way she is behaving. She snuggles gently against his chest and says pitifully that she was worried sick about him. A satisfied smile can be seen on Andreas's face from the words said. He is very pleased to hear these words from Vivian. Vivian still continues to cuddle against his chest. Andreas tries to reassure her and tells her that he is fine. Lucia looks at them frustrated. Tears come to Lucia's eyes. Ouch becomes hurt and sad.